The Village's Oldest Lie, a Miss Marple Mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with a story everyone in the village has known for years, a tale repeated so often that no one ever thought to question it. It was accepted as truth, passed down through generations, and woven quietly into the history of St. Mary Mead. But when a small detail no longer fits the story, Miss Marple begins to look closer. She notices the hesitation when certain names are mentioned, the way older villagers change the subject, and the strange discomfort that follows even the simplest questions. As the pieces slowly fall into place, it becomes clear that the story was never entirely true. It was a lie, an old one, carefully protected, and powerful enough to shape the lives of everyone who believed it. Because sometimes, the most dangerous mysteries are the ones people have lived with for far too long. Before we uncover the truth behind the village's oldest lie, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Village's Oldest Lie. St. Bartholomew's village looked like the sort of place where nothing truly bad could ever happen. The cottages stood close together along narrow lanes, their stone walls warmed by age and their gardens filled with neat rows of flowers. Old oak trees shaded the village green, and every afternoon the church bell rang with a calm rhythm that had remained unchanged for generations. Visitors often said the village felt peaceful in a way that modern towns rarely did. Yet the people who had lived there long enough knew something outsiders did not understand. St. Bartholomew's was a place that kept its memories hidden, and some of those memories were not peaceful at all. The villagers had a quiet habit of avoiding certain subjects. If someone mentioned the old orchard beyond the eastern road, conversation slowed. Someone might suddenly remember a chore that needed doing, or another person might change the subject entirely. The orchard had stood there longer than any living villager could remember, its apple trees twisted with age and its ground covered each autumn with fallen fruit. It belonged to the Harcourt estate, a large house that overlooked the land from a gentle rise. For years the orchard had simply existed as part of the landscape, yet every villager knew it carried a story that no one liked to discuss openly. It was the village's oldest lie, and it had survived for nearly 30 years. On a quiet autumn afternoon, Miss Marple sat beside the window in her small sitting room, knitting slowly while the light faded outside. Her home was modest but comfortable, filled with polished wooden furniture and shelves of carefully arranged books. A pot of tea rested on the small table beside her chair, and the ticking of a clock on the wall provided a gentle rhythm that suited the calm atmosphere of the room. Miss Marple herself appeared exactly as she always did, small and gentle in appearance, with soft grey hair and bright watchful eyes. People who did not know her well often assumed she was simply a kindly elderly woman who enjoyed gardening and knitting. Those who knew her better understood that her mind noticed details others ignored and that she possessed an unusual talent for understanding human nature. The peaceful afternoon was interrupted by a knock at the front door. It was not a loud knock, yet there was a certain urgency in it that made Miss Marple set down her knitting immediately. Visitors rarely arrived without warning in St. Bartholomew's, and when they did it usually meant something unusual had happened. Miss Marple walked through the small hallway and opened the door to find Dr. Leonard Hayes standing on the doorstep. Dr. Hayes had served as the village doctor for nearly 15 years, and during that time he had become well known for his steady manner and practical mind. Yet today he looked different. His expression was tense, and there were faint lines of worry around his eyes that Miss Marple noticed at once. His coat hung loosely over his shoulders as though he had put it on quickly without much thought. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, though his voice carried none of its usual warmth. "Good afternoon, Doctor," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Please come in. You look as though something unpleasant has happened." Dr. Hayes stepped inside and removed his hat slowly. Miss Marple guided him into the sitting room and poured tea for him before asking any questions. She had long ago learned that people spoke more clearly when they had a moment to settle themselves. The doctor accepted the cup and sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "I am afraid there has been an incident this morning," he said after a moment. "One that may concern the entire village." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly in her lap and waited. "It involves Thomas Harcourt," the doctor continued. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. Thomas Harcourt had lived in the large house near the orchard for almost 20 years. He was known as a quiet and private man who rarely took part in village activities. Although he was always polite when spoken to, he seemed to prefer solitude. His wealth allowed him to maintain the Harcourt estate without difficulty, yet few villagers could claim to know him well. "What has happened to Mr. Harcourt?" Miss Marple asked. Dr. Hayes sighed quietly. "He was found this morning in the orchard, beneath one of the apple trees." Miss Marple remained silent as she absorbed the information. "At first it appeared to be a simple accident," the doctor continued. "A ladder was nearby, and it looked as though he might have fallen while inspecting the branches. That explanation would normally satisfy everyone. Unfortunately, when I examined the body more closely, something seemed wrong." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "In what way?" "There was a bruise at the back of his head," Dr. Hayes said. "A strong blow. It could have been caused by the fall, but the position of the body suggests the blow may have come before he fell." Miss Marple's thoughtful expression deepened. "You believe someone struck him?" "I cannot say that for certain yet," the doctor replied carefully. "However, the possibility cannot be ignored." The room became very quiet for several seconds. Outside the window, the wind rustled through the branches of the trees lining Miss Marple's garden. "Who discovered him?" Miss Marple asked at last. "Mrs. Carter," the doctor said. "She takes her usual walk past the orchard every morning. When she noticed Mr. Harcourt lying beneath the tree, she ran to the village to call for help." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Mrs. Carter was known for her reliability and her sharp eyes. If she said she had discovered something unusual, it was unlikely she had imagined it. "Did she notice anything else?" Miss Marple asked. The doctor hesitated slightly before answering. "She made a rather curious remark. She said the orchard looked exactly the same as it did the last time." Miss Marple's eye sharpened with interest. "The last time?" "Yes," Dr. Hayes replied. When I asked her what she meant, she refused to explain further. Miss Marple sat back in her chair and considered the statement carefully. Villagers often avoided direct explanations when old memories were involved. "There was another death there many years ago," she said quietly. Dr. Hayes nodded. "Nearly 30 years ago. A young woman named Alice Benton worked at the Harcourt house as a maid. She was found dead in the orchard one evening." Miss Marple remembered the story faintly. "It was said she fell from a ladder while picking apples." That was the official explanation, the doctor said. But not everyone believed it. Miss Marple studied the pattern of her knitting thoughtfully. Villages had a way of smoothing over uncomfortable truths. When a simple explanation appeared, people often accepted it because the alternative was too disturbing to consider. "What happened after her death?" Miss Marple asked. "Life continued," Dr. Hayes said. The matter faded from conversation. New families moved into the village, and the older residents simply stopped mentioning it. Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. In other words, the story was allowed to settle into silence. The doctor looked toward the window, where the distant orchard could just be seen beyond the hedges and fields. Perhaps the silence was not as complete as we believed. Miss Marple followed his gaze. The old apple trees stood dark against the pale sky, their branches moving slowly in the wind. "Tell me, Doctor," she said after a moment, "who will inherit the Harcourt estate now?" Dr. Hayes returned his attention to her. "His niece, Clara Harcourt. She arrived from London only last week." Miss Marple's knitting paused in midair. "Only last week?" "Yes. She came to stay with her uncle for what was meant to be an extended visit." Miss Marple resumed knitting slowly. "Interesting timing." The doctor leaned forward slightly. "You believe her arrival might be connected?" Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "I simply believe that sudden arrivals and sudden death sometimes appear in the same story." Dr. Hayes finished his tea and stood up slowly. "I had hoped you might help us understand what truly happened," he said. "The villagers are already whispering, and you know how quickly rumors grow in a place like this." Miss Marple rose as well and walked him to the door. As he stepped outside, she glanced once more toward the distant orchard. A quiet thought formed in her mind. 2 deaths beneath the same trees, separated by 3 decades, suggested something more than coincidence. Villages often buried their secrets carefully, but secrets had a habit of resurfacing when the time was right. And if the orchard had already witnessed one lie long ago, Miss Marple suspected that the truth behind it had never disappeared at all. Instead, it had simply waited patiently for someone to notice that the story everyone believed was not the real one. Chapter 2: The Lie That Shaped the Village. The morning after Thomas Harcourt's death, St. Bartholomew's village felt different. It was not a loud change, nor one that could easily be described, but it existed in the way people moved and spoke. Doors opened only halfway, conversations ended quickly, and villagers glanced toward the eastern road more often than usual. In small communities, news traveled faster than the wind, and by sunrise everyone knew that the owner of the Harcourt estate had died in the old orchard. What no one seemed willing to say openly was the thought that had already begun forming in many minds. The orchard had witnessed a death before, and that memory had never completely disappeared. Miss Marple left her cottage shortly after breakfast and began walking along the lane that led toward the Harcourt property. The autumn air was cool and clear, and thin sunlight filtered through the branches of the trees that lined the road. As she walked, she greeted several villagers who passed by, yet she noticed that most of them seemed distracted. Some offered quick polite nods, while others seemed eager to continue walking without stopping. In a village like St. Bartholomew's, silence often spoke louder than conversation, and the silence that morning suggested that everyone was thinking about the same troubling possibility. When Miss Marple reached the edge of the orchard, she paused for a moment before entering. The orchard stretched across a gentle slope of land, its rows of apple trees twisting upward like old hands reaching toward the sky. Fallen apples covered the grass beneath them, and the faint scent of fruit filled the air. It was easy to see why visitors often described the orchard as beautiful. Yet beauty had little to do with truth, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that appearances rarely told the full story. She stepped slowly among the trees, her sharp eyes observing every detail. A ladder stood leaning against one of the larger trees near the center of the orchard. The grass beneath it was slightly disturbed, showing where several people had walked the previous day. This was where Thomas Harcourt had been found. Miss Marple approached the spot quietly and studied the ground. The marks in the grass suggested where the body had lain before it was taken away. Nearby, the ladder stood at a slight angle. Miss Marple examined its position carefully, then glanced up at the branches above. The apples there looked untouched, hanging in heavy clusters that had clearly not been disturbed recently. She stepped closer to the ladder and placed one hand lightly against its side. The wood felt steady and strong, not old enough to break under a person's weight. If Thomas Harcourt had truly been climbing the ladder, there was no obvious reason why he should have fallen. Miss Marple stepped back and looked again at the ground. The ladder was not placed directly beneath the branches where someone would naturally reach for apples. Instead, it stood slightly away from the tree trunk, almost as though it had been moved after it was first placed there. "That is rather unusual," Miss Marple murmured softly to herself. "You could call it that." Miss Marple turned and saw Mrs. Carter approaching slowly along the narrow path between the trees. The older woman carried a small basket, though it appeared empty. Her expression held the serious look of someone who had been thinking about a troubling matter for many hours. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," Miss Marple said kindly. Mrs. Carter nodded. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I suspected you might come here today." "It seemed like a sensible place to begin," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Carter stopped a few steps away from the ladder and looked down at the grass where Thomas Harcourt had been found. "I wish I had taken a different path yesterday morning," she said quietly. Miss Marple waited patiently, allowing the woman time to speak. "When I first saw him lying here, I thought he had simply fallen," Mrs. Carter continued. "That would have been sad, of course, but accidents happen. Yet the moment I stepped closer, something about the scene felt familiar." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Familiar in what way?" Mrs. Carter hesitated before answering. "It looked exactly the same as it did years ago." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You mean when Alice Benton died?" The older woman's eyes widened slightly. "Yes. You remember that, do you?" "I remember hearing about it," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Carter looked around the orchard as though the trees themselves might be listening. "Alice Benton was found beneath a tree almost exactly like this one," she said quietly. "There was a ladder nearby then as well." Miss Marple's thoughtful gaze moved once more to the ladder beside them. "And the explanation was that she had fallen." "That was the explanation," Mrs. Carter agreed. Miss Marple noticed the careful way the woman had spoken the words. "You do not believe it was the truth," she said calmly. Mrs. Carter sighed and lowered her voice. "Many of us never truly believed it." "Why not?" "Because of Thomas Harcourt." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. Mrs. Carter continued speaking in a quiet tone. "Thomas Harcourt was younger then, but he already owned the estate. Alice Benton worked in his household as a maid. She was a cheerful girl, very well liked in the village." Miss Marple listened closely as the story began to unfold. "One evening Alice went into the orchard to gather apples," Mrs. Carter said. "Later that night she was found lying beneath one of the trees with a ladder nearby. The explanation was that she had fallen and struck her head." Miss Marple glanced again at the ladder. "That explanation seems rather convenient," she said softly. Mrs. Carter nodded. "Some people believed there had been an argument between Alice and Mr. Harcourt earlier that day." "What sort of argument?" "No one ever said clearly," Mrs. Carter replied. "But there were whispers that Alice had discovered something she should not have known." Miss Marple's eye sharpened with interest. "What sort of thing might that be?" Mrs. Carter shook her head slowly. "No one ever learned the full truth. The story simply faded away. After a few months people stopped mentioning Alice Benton at all." Miss Marple considered the information carefully. Villages often allowed uncomfortable matters to disappear in this way, not because they were solved, but because no one wished to disturb the quiet balance of daily life. "What about the police?" she asked. "They investigated briefly," Mrs. Carter said. "But there was no clear evidence of wrongdoing. The death was recorded as an accident." Miss Marple looked once more toward the ladder beside the tree. "2 deaths beneath apple trees," she said quietly. "Both explained as accidents." Mrs. Carter met her gaze with a troubled expression. "Yes," she said. "And both of them involving Thomas Harcourt." For several moments neither woman spoke. The orchard seemed even quieter than before, as though the trees themselves held the weight of the old story. Miss Marple finally broke the silence. "Tell me, Mrs. Carter," she said gently. "Who else might know more about what happened 30 years ago?" Mrs. Carter considered the question carefully. "Very few people remain from that time," she said. "Most have moved away or passed on." She paused, then added, "But there is one person who might remember more clearly than anyone else." "Who is that?" "Mr. Samuel Briggs," Mrs. Carter replied. "He worked at the Harcourt estate for many years. In fact, he was there on the night Alice Benton died." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And where might I find Mr. Briggs?" "He lives in the small cottage near the western fields," Mrs. Carter said. "He retired from working at the estate about 10 years ago." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Then it seems I have somewhere to visit this afternoon." Mrs. Carter looked relieved that someone was willing to examine the old story more closely. As Miss Marple left the orchard and returned to the lane, her thoughts moved carefully through everything she had learned. Thomas Harcourt's death had reopened a memory the village had tried to bury for 3 decades. If the 2 deaths were connected, then the truth about Alice Benton might finally come to light. And if that truth had been hidden deliberately, someone in St. Bartholomew's had spent 30 years protecting the same lie. Chapter 3: The Truth Behind the Village's Oldest Lie. Late that afternoon the sky above St. Bartholomew's grew heavy with grey clouds, and a cold wind moved slowly across the fields beyond the village. Miss Marple walked along the narrow lane that led toward the western fields where Samuel Briggs lived. The land in that part of the countryside was quiet and open, divided by low hedges and old wooden fences that had stood for decades. A small stone cottage rested near the edge of the fields, its chimney releasing a thin stream of smoke into the cooling air. The cottage looked simple but neat, and the garden beside it was carefully maintained, which suggested that the man who lived there valued order and routine. Miss Marple opened the small wooden gate and walked up the short path to the door. She knocked gently and waited with patient calm. After a few seconds the door opened and an elderly man appeared. Samuel Briggs was tall but slightly bent with age, and his hands showed the rough strength of someone who had spent many years working outdoors. His eyes, however, were steady and intelligent. Miss Marple greeted him politely and introduced herself. Mr. Briggs studied her face for a moment before nodding slowly and inviting her inside. The cottage was warm and quiet, filled with the soft smell of wood smoke and freshly baked bread. A small fire burned in the fireplace, and the room felt peaceful despite the storm building outside. Once they were seated, Mr. Briggs spoke first. He said that news traveled quickly in St. Bartholomew's and that he had already heard about the death of Thomas Harcourt in the orchard. His voice carried the calm tone of someone who had expected this moment for many years. Miss Marple explained gently that she was trying to understand the truth about the events in the orchard. She then mentioned the name Alice Benton. The moment the name was spoken, Mr. Briggs lowered his eyes and rested his hands on the table. For several seconds he did not speak. Finally he sighed quietly and admitted that he had known Alice Benton very well. She had worked in the Harcourt house many years ago as a maid, and she had been known throughout the village for her cheerful nature and strong sense of fairness. According to Mr. Briggs, Alice had always believed that people should tell the truth even when the truth caused trouble. Miss Marple listened carefully as the old man continued speaking. He explained that on the day Alice Benton died there had been a serious argument inside the Harcourt house. Alice had discovered documents in Thomas Harcourt's study that revealed he had been secretly taking money that did not belong to him. The funds came from family accounts that were meant to be shared with distant relatives. Alice confronted him about the matter because she believed it was dishonest. Mr. Briggs described how Thomas Harcourt had reacted with anger and fear. He had insisted that Alice remain silent, warning her that speaking about the documents would only cause harm. However, Alice refused to remain quiet. She told him clearly that she intended to inform the authorities because she believed what he had done was wrong. That evening Alice went into the orchard to gather apples for the kitchen. According to Mr. Briggs, Thomas Harcourt followed her there. The orchard was quiet at that hour, and the wind moved through the branches while the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills. Mr. Briggs explained that he had been working near the back of the estate when he heard raised voices coming from the orchard. By the time he reached the trees, the argument had already turned violent. Alice Benton was lying beneath one of the apple trees. A ladder stood nearby. Mr. Briggs said that Thomas Harcourt told him she had fallen while climbing, but the fear in his voice made the story difficult to believe. The truth was clear to anyone who looked closely. During the argument, Harcourt had struck Alice in anger, and the blow had caused her to fall and hit the ground with fatal force. Realizing what he had done, he quickly placed the ladder beside the tree to create the appearance of an accident. Mr. Briggs confessed that he had wanted to go to the police immediately, but Thomas Harcourt threatened him. Harcourt reminded him that no one in the village would believe the word of a farm worker against the wealthy owner of the estate. In those days, the social difference between them was powerful enough to silence many people. Afraid of losing his home and his livelihood, Mr. Briggs kept silent. The official investigation declared Alice Benton's death an accident, and over time the village slowly stopped speaking about it. Miss Marple listened without interrupting. She understood that the silence of the village had allowed the lie to survive for 30 years. The story about Alice falling from a ladder had become accepted truth simply because people wanted to believe it. Miss Marple then asked Mr. Briggs about Clara Harcourt. The old man nodded and explained that Clara had arrived in the village only a week earlier. She had come after discovering financial records that suggested her uncle had been stealing money for many years. While searching through old papers in the Harcourt house, she had also discovered letters written by Alice Benton shortly before her death. In those letters, Alice described her argument with Thomas Harcourt and her intention to expose the truth. Clara Harcourt quickly realized that her uncle had been responsible not only for the stolen money but also for the death of Alice Benton many years earlier. Determined to confront him, she waited until the following morning and followed him into the orchard. According to Mr. Briggs, he had seen the two of them walking toward the trees early that morning. Their conversation soon became heated as Clara accused her uncle of both crimes. Thomas Harcourt denied the accusations at first, but when Clara threatened to reveal the letters and the financial records, his temper broke. The argument moved beneath the same tree where Alice Benton had died 3 decades earlier. Harcourt tried to frighten Clara into silence, just as he had done with others before. However, Clara refused to be intimidated. The confrontation became physical when Harcourt attempted to seize the letters she carried. In the struggle he lost his balance on the uneven ground near the ladder. He fell backward and struck the back of his head against the hard earth beneath the tree. The blow was severe enough to end his life almost instantly. Miss Marple considered the story carefully. The truth was simple yet tragic. The lie that had protected Thomas Harcourt for 30 years had finally returned to destroy him. The orchard that had once hidden his crime had now revealed it. Mr. Briggs told Miss Marple that Clara had been deeply shaken by the event and had not intended for anyone to die. She had only wanted the truth to be known. When Mrs. Carter later discovered the body, Clara was already on her way back to the house, shocked by what had happened. Miss Marple explained gently that the full truth must now be told to the authorities so the past could finally be understood. Mr. Briggs agreed firmly. After carrying the weight of silence for so many years, he was ready to speak openly at last. When Miss Marple stepped outside the cottage, the first drops of rain had begun to fall across the fields. She walked slowly back toward the village while thinking about everything she had learned. St. Bartholomew's had believed a comfortable lie for 3 decades because it was easier than facing an unpleasant truth. Yet lies have a way of aging badly. They grow fragile over time, and eventually even the smallest crack can cause them to collapse completely. As evening settled over the village and the rain began to fall more heavily, Miss Marple looked once more toward the distant orchard. The truth had waited patiently beneath those trees for 30 long years, but at last it had been revealed. And sometimes, she reflected, justice does not come quickly. Sometimes it simply waits for the right moment. If you enjoyed uncovering this mystery and want to hear more intense village secrets and clever investigations like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. In quiet places like these, another hidden truth may always be waiting to be discovered.